Good morning and good afternoon to those that are joining us today for the Accounts Payable and Receivable webinar. I'd like to turn this over to Brian Tierney.
Thank you for joining us, folks. My name is Brian Tierney. I'm the presenter for today's Accounts Payable and Receivable overview as we go through those concepts in Lightspeed. Just to touch on some housekeeping points for today's webinar, we do have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, but during the presentation, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send those questions via the chat function within the bottom of the Zoom screen. We have some panelists that are standing by live to answer those questions for you in real time as we go through the presentation. And if some of the questions are pertinent to discussion during the presentation, we'll bring those up live and have some overview of those concepts and answer those questions in real time. The panelists will also continue to answer questions beyond the webinar today. So we will provide a full list of questions and answers even after the webinar is complete. Everyone will be provided a link to the video along with the PowerPoint presentation and the question and answer document via email following the presentation. Again, my name is Brian Tierney. I am the Customer Development Manager at Lightspeed. I've been with Lightspeed for a little over 12 years, and my experience has been on the support and implementation side of the company. Recently joined the sales department as kind of a consultant and a support agent for the sales department. Prior to my time with Lightspeed, I worked in a dealership here in Utah in the parts service and sales departments and spent 16 years there. And I've got about 30 years worth of experience in Lightspeed up to this point. And really my interest in the industry and in Lightspeed and working in a dealership and working with Lightspeed stems from my interest in the motorcycle industry. And that's what's brought me here with you today. So thanks for having me and thanks for joining us. What do we plan to cover in today's webinar? Well, today we're going to talk about accounts receivable and accounts payable. And some of the things that we'll talk about in the presentation are the sources of AP invoices. How do they land on the accounts payable side of the program? We'll also look at managing AP invoices, paying the bills essentially. And we'll also talk about receivable accounts. What kind of receivable accounts live in Lightspeed and how do you utilize them for your day-to-day activity in the program? And then also, how do we bring money in from those customers and clients to manage our receivable department? And as mentioned, following the presentation, we'll go through a brief question and answer period, and we'll be able to field some of the questions you might have near the end of the presentation. So let's start by talking about the sources of accounts payable invoices. And one of the things that you'll probably hear me say a few times throughout the presentation is the idea that Lightspeed is a real-time accounting interface. And what that means is as we conduct business on the parts, service, and sales side of the business, the accounting side is directly impacted in real time as those transactions occur. And we'll look at some examples of how that happens on the parts side of the business, the service side, and the sales side of the business, and what to expect in terms of a real-time, somewhat of an automated accounts payable experience utilizing functions on those sides of the business. So let's look at some examples of those now. I'm going to pull up the Lightspeed interface on the screen and you'll see the word Lightspeed showing up. And those of you that are familiar with this screen, you know this as the login screen, or sometimes we lovingly refer to this as the splash screen in Lightspeed. And we'll just talk about some ways that accounts payable invoices are created on the parts side of the business. And I'm going to start by going into the receiving module. So if we can imagine that after an order has been created and now the UPS, the FedEx, or the delivery person is knocking on the back door of the parts department, parts person opens up the door, receives the box into the building, takes the box back to the receiving portion of the parts department. That person opens up the box, pulls the packing slip out, goes to receiving in Lightspeed, and goes ahead and opens up the supplier that's listed on the screen that that person is now receiving against. And we'll just take the supplier DMS, Lightspeed DMS, as our example in today's presentation. So we've got a few parts on the screen that we need to receive. And as the parts clerk is reviewing the documentation from the box and the parts therein, goes to the very top of the receiving screen and enters a packing slip number. And this will become more important as we look at the AP side of this interface and this exchange in just a few minutes. But for the sake of expediting the process, I'm just going to click Receive PO, which is going to receive all the parts on that particular purchase order, and I'm going to click Save. Now at that point, the packing slip number or invoice number that I've entered on the receiving side of the business has generated an entry on the accounts payable side automatically for my accounts payable clerk. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and close my receiving screen, and I'm going to go to Payables and select Parts Packing Slips, which is where that entry that we just created on the parts side of the house was created on the AP side. I'm then going to search for my supplier. In this case was DMS. And if I double click on DMS, I've got an entry that was created during the receiving process. It's creating a little bit of a communication and an automation of that AP invoice on the AP side. I then go ahead and select the invoice or packing slip number from my list. And I'm also verifying that on my billing statement, the shipment total that's presented on the screen matches so that we jive. And if there's something like a freight charge or a discount that's applied that I see on my statement side that maybe my parts clerk didn't see, I can enter freight. Let's say there's $5 in freight for this particular accounts payable entry. I click New Invoice, and it brings me to my vendor invoice screen where my parts purchases account is offset. My freight account is offset because of the $5 worth of freight that I've added. And I now have an opportunity at the very bottom of the screen to click Pay Now, where I can mark this as paid by check. I can print a check to my vendor. I can pay by Corpay through an electronic interface, and we'll get more into that in just a moment, or I can utilize a credit card for an electronic funds transfer, or however I'm paying for that, or I can simply hit Save and save that for a future payment. And we'll look at that in just a moment when we get to the payment side of AP. Another example of how entries are made to the AP side of the business is through the service department. If I go to my estimates and repair orders screen, and I'm going to jump into Miss Linda Smith's repair order, and we'll take a look at sublet labor that's been added to Miss Linda Smith's repair order that's directly talking to the accounts payable side of the software. Click on the Work tab where all the magic happens in the repair order, all the activity that happens in the repair order lives in Work. I'm going to select my skid plate gusset and weld job, and notice that on the bottom of the screen in the sublet line, there's an entry for Wednesday Webinar Sublet Company. They've done some aluminum welding for me. They're charging us $85 for the service. We're paying a vendor, Wednesday Webinar Sublet Company, for that service, and they've provided an invoice number of C-255. And then I would go ahead and hit the Sublet Closeout button at that point, and it's going to create an entry on the accounts payable side of the software immediately for me, allowing for the accounts payable clerk to find that invoice to make that payment in the future. Another example of how AP invoices are created on the sales side of the business, if I go to Sales and I'm going to select Major Unit Inventory, and we're going to drill into a particular stock number. I'm going to look for stock number N84B648, for example. And this is a boat that's been added to our major unit or our sales inventory. So when that boat is stocked into the system, and when it's stocked in, we include things like the stock number, year, make, model, and even maybe photographs of the vehicle as we're putting it into the sales side of the inventory of our software. At that point, in the very center of the screen is the purchasing box where the cost or the invoice amount for that unit that lives in my inventory is applied. And that gets applied by clicking Update AP. And at that point, I can create an AP invoice through the sales side of the business that communicates directly to accounts payable in real time. In this case, we'll notice there's already an invoice amount. And if I hit my little spyglass next to that invoice amount, I can see the vendor that was paid, the flooring vendor, Wednesday Webinar Flooring, the invoice number, and a little bit of a description, serial number, VIN number, whole ID number, whatever it might be that correlates to that AP invoice that we've created. So we can see that there's three different ways that through the parts, service, and sales side, normal daily activity, we're directly interfacing with accounts payable to create AP invoices on the AP side. Now, one of the other ways that we can create AP invoices is through manual creation, or we can utilize recurring invoices. And we'll kind of dive into the AP side of the business since we've just been spending our time on parts, service, and sales. Let's go right into the AP side of the interface and see what that looks like for the manual creation of invoices and also for recurring invoices. So I'm going to select Payables. And I'm going to select recurring invoices, and we'll talk about what a recurring invoice is. In this particular menu, I've got 3, and maybe we pay on a monthly basis our uniform laundry company that does all of the laundry for our technicians' uniforms. And in this instance, I'll double click just to give you a sense of what to expect. We're paying the uniform company $264.36 per month. Directly impacts accounts payable when we create that invoice, and it is offset against our shop supplies and small tools expense account. So I can create a variety of different recurring invoices for things like our utility bills, internet bills, power and light, anything that needs to be recurring to save me the manual creation of those invoices, to save me a little bit of time, to reduce mistakes, and just to streamline the accounts payable experience. And when it's time to post those entries or create those recurring invoices, I check the box, click Add Invoice, and it drops right into the accounts payable side of the Pay Invoices side. We'll look at that in just a moment. Another example of a AP invoice creation would be if I just simply need to record an expense that the business has incurred. And there's going to be things that'll happen on the AP side that don't necessarily correspond to a parts, service, or sales transaction, and don't necessarily correspond to a recurring invoice, but they're expenses incurred, services or products that are rendered throughout the days, weeks, and months of your business. And this might be an example of one of those where we're going to create a fresh vendor invoice that doesn't connect to anything that currently exists in the system. We're just incurring an expense, for example. And we're going to utilize our Wednesday webinar Sublet company once again as our vendor. My invoice number for this particular creation is going to be, let's call it C-455. And it's going to be, we're going to call this $256.36 worth of work that's going to repaint and repair a storage tank that lives in the service department. So it's not directly correlated to any kind of a repair order transaction. It's just an expense that we're incurring, and we're ultimately going to apply this to maybe shop supplies or office supplies or an expense account. And in this case, we're going to apply it directly to one of our sublet cost of goods account. And I'm going to utilize my distribution button at the very top of the AP invoice side of the business. And I'm going to select my sublet internal repair order work expense account distribution, which is going to populate the offsetting account, gives me a description, shows me 100% of that value is being debited to that expense account. The credit is going directly against accounts payable. At this point, if I've got somebody standing there in front of me ready to collect a check, I can click Pay Now. Select check as my transaction type, pick the checking account that I want to pay out of, enter the appropriate starting number or the next check number that's in my printer, click OK, and it's going to print a check. I can also save this for a future payment if the individual isn't directly there in front of me and I don't need to necessarily pay this right away. I can schedule this for a future payment, or I can utilize ePay and electronically pay for this transaction using a third-party interface like CorePay, for example. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just save this for a future payment. And we're going to go now to the Pay Invoices side of Payables. Click Payables, go to Pay Invoices, and that takes me into the list of all the vendors that have outstanding invoices within them. Some of the invoices might be credits, some of them are debits, but essentially this is where I'm going to pay the bills. And that's kind of the next topic of our discussion is paying the bills. And Lightspeed offers a number of different ways that you can pay the bills. So far, we've talked a little bit about printing a check. We kind of made mention of the ePay electronic payment function. And it's possible that maybe I've already paid something. Maybe somebody hand wrote a check, didn't quite know how to utilize the software, wasn't quite up to speed on it, may have just handwritten a check, and we want to record that as being paid. Or maybe we utilized a credit card during some sort of a interface with the client or a vendor, and we just simply want to mark those as paid. So let's go back into Pay Invoices side of AP and talk about how that works. And we're going to utilize the Guinea Pig Wednesday webinar AP vendors as our kind of our guinea pigs in this process. And thus far, we've, as a group, collectively, we've made some invoices throughout our experience thus far. On the parts side of the house, we've made some on the service side of the house. We've made one on the sales side of the house. And we just made one together as a group for expenses rendered on the payable side of the house. And what you'll notice is I've selected my flooring vendor for Wednesday webinar, my parts vendor for Wednesday webinar, and I've selected my sublet company. So the three different interfaces with vendors that we've talked about thus far are selected on my screen. And in doing so, it brings up the invoices that are due to those specific vendors. Now you'll notice we've got the sublet closed out that we did together. We've got the flooring invoice that was created on the sales side of the business listed here. We've got our shipment for the parts received on the parts side of the house listed on the screen. And we've got that AP invoice that we created to generate the expense for repairing and repainting the service department storage tank. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pay all of those simultaneously. So I check the box for all those invoices because my billing is due and I've got to pay those invoices. So at this point, I can click Pay All Selected. And what will happen is if I'm utilizing my check printing functions, if I'm literally printing checks, when I select my checking account and I select check, I can then print 3 different checks for the 3 different vendors that are presented. If I want to electronically send a payment using ePay, which is a relatively new function in Lightspeed, if I want to make those payments to vendors electronically, I have a third party like CorePay, for example, that Lightspeed communicates directly to, sends out payments electronically to those providers, and allows me to make those payments and mark those as paid in the system. In the question and answer document that we'll provide following this meeting, I'll include a link to a video that discusses electronic pay, ePay, or CorePay, just to offer some additional details and context to that particular topic. But for now, I'm going to mark all of these as paid, and we're going to utilize our default checking account. I'm going to go ahead and print some checks. We're going to mark these as a check type, and I'm going to click Pay, and it marks all of those invoices as paid. If I was printing checks, my checks would have now printed. If I was using electronic pay or ePay through Lightspeed, CorePay would now send out those payments to my vendors immediately. Let's move over to receivables. We're going to talk about the 2 different types of receivable accounts as we go through our receivable exploration in Lightspeed. And there's really 2 different types of accounts that are presented to receivable customers, open items and balance forward. And there's some benefits to both, and there's some reasons why you would use one over the other. We'll talk about what those are, and I'm going to go ahead and bring Lightspeed back up on the screen, and we're going to dive into receivables, and I'm going to select AR customers. And once again, we're going to utilize our Wednesday description for AR customers. I've got a retail over-the-counter customer named Wednesday Smith, and I've got a contracts in transit or a lien holder called Wednesday Webinar Financial Holdings. And we'll talk about the difference between those and why we would use one receivable type over another. Let's double click on Wednesday Webinar Financials and talk about the different types of charge accounts. When I go to charge accounts on that charge account customer, I've got a drop down for account information and account type, open item and balance forward. For my financial accounts, for lien holders, for any kind of a receivable customer that uses a purchase order number is a pretty good rule of thumb, you'll use an open item. And essentially what that means, as opposed to balance forward, is open item when you take a payment on a particular receivable, that payment is going towards a specific charge. So on a lien holder, when I'm utilizing a lien holder accounts receivable account, and we'll go through an example of that to say, finalize a sales deal in real time so we can record the sale, even though we haven't received funding from the lien holder yet. We might charge that sales deal to a lien holder account, and when that money comes in from the bank, that money gets applied not only to reduce the balance on the AR account, but it goes towards a specific receivable, goes towards a specific entry. As opposed to a balance forward, which when we receive money towards a balance forward account, it just simply reduces the balance and it's not going towards a specific charge. Works really well for retail customers, for those that are not using purchase order numbers, that are just developing a balance throughout the day, weeks, and months in your business, you might use balance forward. So let's look at a couple of examples of how to utilize those on the parts and sales side of the business. So if I go into a parts invoice and we've got our customer, Wednesday Smith, got an invoice that's on hold for her. Let's pull up her invoice and see what she's going to purchase from us. Oh, she's got a few parts on the parts side of the house that she'd like to purchase from us. So I'm going to go ahead and cashier my invoice. I'm going to select AR charge and charge it directly to Wednesday Smith's accounts receivable account. I'll cashier that invoice, Customer takes delivery of the parts today, an invoice prints, and I'm handing that invoice now to the customer, and she's developed a balance on her accounts receivable account. Another example that we can utilize accounts receivable accounts from the sales side of the business, if I go to leads, quotes, and deals on the sales side of the business, and I'm going to look for Mr. Jeff Emmig's sales deal. We'll dial into Mr. Jeff Emmig's sales deal and see what he's about to purchase from us. In fact, it looks like we're going to be delivering a unit to him and his family on Saturday, but he's purchasing a Kubota tractor from us. We've got our total dollar values at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to finalize this deal because we want to record the delivery of the vehicle. We want to record the sale in real time. Customer's already taken the unit. We've already paid for, or I've already printed all of the contracts. Customer is happy, and we just now want to record the sale. So I'm going to charge this against my Wednesday webinar financial holdings AR account and click OK. So we've now just seen a couple of different ways to utilize receivables on the parts and sales side of the business, but now let's look at how do we receive monies? How do we receive funding for those charges that we've just incurred on the receivables side of the business? And there's two different ways. So we talked about the balance forward accounts. We talked about utilizing open items accounts. So let's talk about receiving those monies and see how we can bring the money into the system. Updating the AR balance. There's a number of ways that we can do that. A miscellaneous receipt, which we'll look at in just a moment. How do we update the balance for Miss Wednesday Smith's account? We'll utilize a credit memo to update the balance on the financial holdings accounts. We talked about cashiering an invoice, and we did that using a parts invoice. We did that using a sales deal, finalizing the sales deal. We'll look at some recurring charges, and we'll look at ways that we can apply finance charges on the receivable side of the business now in a couple of different examples. So let's go back to Lightspeed. And let's talk about taking money in for Miss Wednesday Smith's AR balance. Going to cashiering, I'm going to go into a miscellaneous receipt, and we're going to receive $100 towards Miss Wednesday Smith's AR account. She's going to write us a check, and we're going to take an AR payment towards Miss Wednesday Smith's accounts receivable account. And I'm going to even put some notes in there just to kind of let whomever's looking at this receipt or looking at reports later in the day understand what it is that we took the payments on. So I might put a payment on account in the description, the check number that was recorded during the transaction, and I'm going to take a payment. And we can see that Miss Wednesday Smith's current AR balance is $1,112.48. And as soon as I take that $100, it's going to reduce that balance for her. And we're also going to be able to document that we received the money. Now, when it comes to bringing money in from banks, we're going to utilize a tool called a customer memo, which allows us to either do a debit or a credit memo. In this case, we're going to do a credit memo, meaning money's coming into the bank or coming into our business. And we're going to do the customer, in this case, was our Wednesday webinar financial holdings lien holder. I'm going to look up that sales deal because this is an open item account, and I'm going to add that to our payment. And essentially, we've got $22,603.75 that's due to us from the lien holder. I'm going to copy and paste that into my description just so that I have a record of what that looks like if I'm looking at any historical reporting, any kind of if I ever have a question about why did we bring this money into the system, I'll have a definition as to why. And I might have a number, an invoice number, a correspondence number from the bank. I'm just going to enter the stock number for our particular example today. And we're going to say we're receiving $22,603.75, and I'm going to apply $22,603 to that deal, essentially paying off the sales deal, applying that credit memo to the deal, and bringing that money directly into our checking account. And when I hit save, I've now completed the entry of the money into my system. Now, a couple of other thoughts when it comes to receivables. How do we update the balance? Going back to our slide, updating the AR balance. If I go into Lightspeed and look at two different options, recurring charges, we might have a storage charge for a customer. Maybe we're storing their RV or boat on our lot, and we're charging the customer, in this case, $500 or $100, whatever the situation might be. I'm going to charge that customer a storage charge each month. And so, for example, we're charging Mr. Dean Biber $100 every month for a term of 12 months. And as soon as I post this, it updates the AR account showing that we've charged that $100 to Mr. Biber's account. And then just like we did with Miss Wednesday Smith, we can receive money through a miscellaneous receipt and reduce the balance and update the balance. We can also generate AR statements. So if we want to let the customer know that they owe us money, we can send the statement to them via email or via postal. And this is an example of the screen that we'd be looking at where we can send a statement to our receivable customers to let them know what their balance is, what the history is on the receivable account, and it gives them a chance to review the details. If they ever have any questions, generally the questions are answered by the document. They can reach out to us, as our statements are going to include a dealer logo, full contact information, and then the amount that's due to the business. You can send that out via email or via post, and that allows us to then receive money from those customers in a variety of means. So all the things that we've talked about thus far, creating AP invoices, making payments on AP, incurring charges to receivables, receiving money from receivable customers and from outside lenders. How do we monitor those things? What are some of the tools that we can utilize to view the data related to those particular departments? And through a couple of different tools, AP aging and AR aging are ways that we can monitor those values. If I go into payables and I go to AP aging, I can get a sense of what my AP customers look like, who has a balance, how old that balance is. And this is something that I would recommend running at least once a month, and some businesses are doing it more frequently than that. I can run this as a detail or a summary report, and it's going to essentially give me a list of all of the vendors that have outstanding balances with them and how old that balance is. Same situation is going to occur on the receivables side of the business. I can go into reports, select AR aging, run the report as either a detail or a summary, and it's going to give me a sense of what the balances are for my receivable customers and the age of those balances. Part of the month-end process is running either of those reports, but in many cases, some of our customers are doing it more frequently than that, and it's going to give you a sense of what the customer balances are and how old those balances are for your business. So as we've talked about utilizing Lightspeed to manage accounts payable and accounts receivable, we've seen how Lightspeed uses real-time accounting to post entries to those departments on the parts, service, and sales side of the house. We've kind of reviewed how to view the billing management tools on accounts payable and accounts receivable. We've seen them as accounts management tools. We looked at some examples of reporting and analytics, and we talked about statements. And that takes us to the conclusion of today's webinar. Just wanted to let you know we have a couple of additional webinars coming up. Tomorrow we have an overview of some of the new features and functions within Lightspeed. We have another Wednesday webinar 30 days from now that goes over the sales module. We'll discuss leads, quotes, and deals concepts. We'll look at the CRM tool as it relates to sales and also look at the mobile application. At this point, if anybody has any questions or if we have any thoughts we'd like to discuss, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Perfect, Brian. I really enjoyed what you went through there. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. We'll try to ask a few as the time allows us. But one question out there was, if you use Corpay, will that only have an entry in the bank account?
Great question. So what we'll do is we'll send a video on the Q&A document that'll be shared with everybody following the webinar, and it'll give you a more detailed view of Corpay. Corpay allows you to manage multiple accounts, to pay through multiple accounts. So it does create an interface that's customizable to your experience. So in many cases, it is directly connected to a single bank account, but that's not necessarily the rule. It just really kind of depends on how the client wants to set that up.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Another question that we've got is, on the recurring invoices, there is no place to add sales tax. How is that done?
Oh, great question. That brings up a very good question. It's true. There is not a way to add sales tax to recurring invoices. So that might be something that could either be done through an additional invoice just to charge tax to a particular AR account, say through a parts invoice or through a miscellaneous receipt. But that's a question that I've not been asked before. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I think just off the cuff, my best answer would be utilizing a parts invoice to charge tax or miscellaneous receipt.
Perfect. Well, very good. I think that we're out of time for this week's webinar, and like Brian had mentioned, we do have some unanswered questions, but all those will be answered, you know, at a later time. So, thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you.
Have a great afternoon.